Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Catherine Fleming Bruce with Camelot Excalibur Trust, and we are once again assembled in response to a SCOTUS decision. We have had the opportunity here at Camelot to have conversations with several scholars and historians reflecting on recent decisions such as Alexander versus South Carolina NAACP. Today, we are going to reflect on Monday's Supreme Court decision, which is the last decision in the calendar, from what I understand. And this decision was Trump versus United States, popularly discussed as the immunity decision. So today I brought together some folks who are returning in a conversation about some of these SCOTUS rulings. A little bit ago, there was the Trump versus Anderson decision. And we had a number of historians submit an amicus brief with that ruling. And so these scholars who are here were among the group of scholars who submitted a brief with regard to Trump versus Anderson. So they're going to be well versed in the ability to talk about the current decision in line with what they've looked at in terms of the law and in terms of history with these decisions, and not just in regard to the plaintiffs in the case and the defendants, but also looking at the defendants as the American people and our defense of our democracy and our division and separation of powers, in our understanding of history. All of these things combined are what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm so thankful for the three of you who've been able to join me in quite a quick response to yesterday's ruling. So first, we have Harry Watson. Harry O. Watson is University of North Carolina at Chapel Hills, Atlanta Distinguished Professor of Southern Culture Emeritus. And we have Vernon Burton, who is the Judge Matthew Perry. Judge Matthew J. Perry, Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University. And we have Paul D. Escott, who is the Reynolds Professor of History Emeritus at Wake Forest University. And I want to thank all three of you once again for being here. And I'd like to start with a short clip from a film called Frost Nixon, which many of you may have had the opportunity to see. This is an exchange representing the interview that David Frost had with Nixon and his memorable statement that I think is very relevant today. So I'm going to share that screen with you, and we're going to hear that clip.
Doing what we were all doing was not criminal. Look, when you're in office, you got to do a lot of things sometimes that are not always, in the strictest sense of the law, legal. But you do them because they're in the greater interests of the nation.
Right, wait, just so I understand correctly, are you really saying that in certain situations, the president can decide whether it's in the best interests of the nation and then do something illegal?
I'm saying that when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
I'm sorry?
That's what I believe. But I realize no one else shares that view.
Well, there are a couple of things that really struck me. I have been hopeful that people would follow the rule of law, that the court, I had faith in the court, even with all the problematic decisions we've had. But this, I feel, has really gone too far. It's not just from the perspective of a historian, but it's a perspective of a citizen who believes in democracy. I'm actually reminded very much of the reaction of the African American press after the Plessy v. Ferguson statement in Plessy v. decision 1896, and one Kansas newspaper was an African American newspaper said that the court had so wantonly disgraced itself that it was time to put an end to the existence of this infernal, infamous body. I never thought I would agree with it, but if we've come to this, I do wonder. And it could not help but remind me from the study I did for Justice Deferred Race in the Supreme Court that, like Dred Scott, this Supreme Court invented a new legal principle out of whole cloth. Effort to end an intense public controversy. That time, and Dred Scott, of course, worried about the Civil War, worried about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the very similar kind of crisis we're facing in democracy now, I believe, about the nation. And what they did to end it was by ruling decisively on one side. Today's decision, I think, enters the sort of anti-canon on the Supreme Court with Dred Scott as one of the worst and likely most damaging opinions in its history. Sonia Sotomayor and the dissenters, particularly Justice Jackson as well as Sonia, were absolutely spectacular, and I recommend everyone read that dissent. I think that's what we will remember as historians later. But the court, under this ruling, it seems to me, would have cleared Hitler, Stalin, Mayo for all of the crimes because they were murdering people. In the case of Hitler's, Germany's chancellor, trying to exterminate Jews as part of their official capacity. To me, that's how bad this case is. I can go on and on and on, but I want to hear from my colleagues who I respect so much. And I'm pretty emotional, having spent a lot of time studying the court, looking at bad decisions over time. I fear that Justice Roberts, despite what he wanted to be remembered as, will be remembered for Shelby County, gutting the Voting Rights Act, and taking away the rule of law that all people are equal and not above the law, no matter who they were. Taking what clearly, if you were an originalist or someone who claims to be originalist, what has always been the president, what George Washington saw and understood the presidency to be. When John Adams turned over the presidency to Thomas Jefferson, there's no doubt. You read the Declaration of Independence, that mission statement, what this revolution that becomes the United States, that develops this Constitution, had in mind for the president. That goes without saying to all the things that we outlined in our amicus brief that we can talk about as well. But I've talked too much. Let's hear from my colleagues.
Harry?
Well, thank you, Vernon, and I completely agree with your sentiments on this. Going further, it seems to try to put this in historical perspective, I think it's very ironic that the court, which has elevated historic tradition to a grandiose level in terms of judging what they will accept in matters of things like gun control, saying that we're still locked into whatever it was the 18th century wanted in that regard, has now turned around and forgotten that the purpose of the United States Constitution was not to create a powerful presidency, it was to restrain executive authority. And the decision, Robert's decision says, well, you know, we have countervailing interests, we have to have a strong president, and we have to have the rule of law, but then utterly guts the rule of law part and says essentially that the president is utterly unrestrained as far as practical matters are concerned. He has absolute immunity in connection with what they call his core constitutional duties, and he has presumptive immunity in regard to more peripheral duties of the president. And then in his unofficial actions, he is not exempt from the prosecution. But those unofficial actions are so minor and peripheral, they seem to amount to a statement that if the president gets in his car and roars down the highway at 90 miles an hour, the highway patrol can give him a ticket unless he says he's hurrying to an official meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a restriction on authority that's utterly meaningless, because the president's violation of the speeding laws would matter to him and the other people on the highway at that moment, but is not going to affect the body of liberty of the United States the way his official duties are. So I think it's a decision that's not only terrible on the merits, but it's also in complete violation of our historical traditions.
And precedents.
Yeah.
Legal precedents.
Yeah.
Paul?
I feel that both Vernon and Harry make very good points. And I would want to expand just a little bit on one of the points that Harry raised. If we look at the decisions of the court on the 14th Amendment, on this case, and other decisions, one has to conclude that instead of having a court that is pursuing the rule of law, we instead have a very partisan, fiercely ideological series of decisions coming from the court. Some of the conservative, or perhaps better said, reactionary members of the court talk about the importance of using an originalist approach to understanding the Constitution. That is, they're going to see what was meant at the time that the Constitution or the law was written. But instead, we find that from one decision to another, the court jumps around to jettison its originalist approach and adopt some different theory of interpretation in order to suit an outcome that is obviously going to have some important political implications. Mm-hmm. In this case, it's absolutely clear that the founders never would have imagined that this kind of decision could become the ruling doctrine of the United States. And the history was very clear in regard to the 14th Amendment and whether that would disqualify Trump as well. But the court chose to ignore those things. And if one wants to read the dissent that was written by Justice Sotomayor, that person in reading it would be reminded of how important it was to the founders that the president not be gifted with king-like powers and instead be restrained by the rule of law. It's just remarkable that this decision has been made. And if Joe Biden had said yesterday that he was going to order the arrest or the execution of Donald Trump as a danger to the society based on that Supreme Court decision, the reaction would have been that that's outrageous. How could that be? But now we have a court that is basically saying this sort of power can be lodged in the president and he is not going to be held accountable for it.
Yeah.
Another interesting point that I remember from a conversation I had with a scholar on British history back during the coronation of King Charles. And he made the point that even though Charles is a king, he has less power, although we use the word king and we kind of think of it as, a specific, very broad set of powers. His powers are limited. by Parliament and his government. And he said the US president may have actually more power than the king in some situations. So now, with this change in the court, the president has even more power than that. Those powers are amplified, and the ability to hold the president accountable are reduced by this decision.
You know, as a matter of fact, first of all, Catherine, you're absolutely right on that. But as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why King Charles III's power is limited is because King Charles I had his head cut off,
right,
for high treason. And you know, we've had a lot of careless talk, I think, about how you know, the president of the United States is not a king and he can't be above the law. Well, Charles I lost his head because he wasn't above the law either.
mm-hmm.
And Parliament arrested him and put him on trial and off with his head. Well, we're not going to do that to Donald Trump. God forbid we should even think about it. But nevertheless, the King of England has been subject to the rule of law from before that action and most emphatically after it.
Mm-hmm.
So we are violating our British constitutional heritage as well as our American constitutional heritage.
Yeah, I really believe that when you look at this, all you can decide is this principle of democracy really relies that no one, including the president, no one is above the rule of law. And this totally violates it. And before we started, Paul, Harry and I were joking, and I said, I thought that President Biden, when he made what I thought was an extraordinarily good statement with I dissent following Sonia Sotomayor, that he should have said, hypothetically, I'm ordering, SEAL Team 6 to go out and assassinate my opponent, which is actually was discussed in the arguments on this case. And it comes back with this, is that really that kind of frightening thing to me about how can democracy survive if we have this kind of ruling. And I actually have hopes that it will be revisited, and perhaps as the trial goes forward, or at least the hearing that will happen, so that the evidence can be looked at, that maybe something can be done. I just don't know. We're in this terrible situation now where Congress, like the Supreme Court, is so super partisan divided that there's not much that can happen to do anything. And that's one of the reasons that the Supreme Court in the last few years have sort of taken on the role of what the legislature should be doing on all of these kind of issues, it seems to me.
Now, I also have heard that there's a effort to ask Congress to pass a constitutional amendment restoring presidential liability. So do you think that might be an option that would actually work?
I think
this ruling.
Somebody else. Paul, were you about to say something?
Well, as long as the country is so divided, it would probably be impossible, should such an amendment be proposed by Congress, to have it ratified by 3/4 of the states. So I don't see that as any rapid solution to the terrible mess that we're in.
And I was just going to say, and I bet Harry will agree, like what France has gone through 5 constitutions, Canada several. I mean, we have the same original constitution, but it is nearly impossible to get amendment. Look at the ERA.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, to get the ratification process is nearly impossible. Again, I can't help but particularly Paul and I have studied very carefully the Civil War era and Harry, the development of democracy right before that. And I really cannot remember in my studies a time that is so parallel to the crisis that we saw in the 1850s to 1860 that led, let's hope not now, to a civil war, but this inability to find ways to compromise. And just, this is a little off target, but I was really amazed that they were able to get a bipartisan bill on the border and immigration. And then the leader of one political party, the other, the candidate who this case is all about, said, "Not, don't do it. We want to use it as a campaign issue," not caring about the country. But I thought the Supreme Court cared about the rule of law and cared about the country, even if I disagreed with so many of their arguments. And the other thing that has really bothered me, you go back to Justice Roberts' confirmation on the court, Justice Kavanaugh, almost all of these people, and they all claim that the rule of law was what was important. And they each, as I remember, at least with Kavanaugh, and I'm pretty sure Roberts, when I was studying this, said that the president was not above the law. So what changed? What happened?
Right, right. And I also noticed, of course, I didn't get to read through the entire 77 pages of the ruling, but I did get to the part where Justice Barrett didn't have a dissent, but had something that was supporting the decision, but it was saying, well, I think we should have gone on and had more clarity about whether something was going to be official, whether these actions that Trump took were official or not, something like that. We should have made the ruling instead of passing the buck to the lower courts. Now, perhaps if she had been more forceful and dissented based on that instead of going along, I don't know if that would have been enough to stop that decision. But the opportunity was there.
Honestly, I don't
for
think
her to be one of the dissenters, at least.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Catherine, but I honestly don't think it would have made any difference, because what she was asking for was a set of bright line guidelines between what are official and what are, in effect, semi-official and what are unofficial actions of the president. But the majority decision says, like, fool that I am, I thought the official duties of the president were spelled out in the Constitution and in the statutory law. But John Roberts says that I'm losing in my notes, but he's saying mere allegations that the president has violated the law cannot make a determination between a official and a semi-official action of the president. You have to have a case-by-case, decision-making process by the courts every time somebody alleges that the president has violated the law. Well, what in the world does a prosecutor do but allege that so-and-so violated the law? And he asks, and that's what the grand jury does when they indict you. So essentially, when Robert says a mere allegation isn't good enough, he's saying the kind of findings by prosecutors that you and I have to worry about when we break the speed limit or whatever don't apply to the president at all. And nor, he goes on to say, can statutes adequately describe what the official duties of the president are.
Oh,
Yeah.
And beyond that, Harry, I think we have not focused on something that's really critical if you look back into where this is going, that motives
Oh yeah, motives.
does not matter. And yet, you know, if you can't have effect, which is covered by the duties, then the motive to overthrow the government, to foment a counter-revolution, to overthrow the process of election of a president, how can you show anything? How can you?
We can't.
It is going to be very hard for any
Motive is
under
always
these
a factor in
circumstances.
determining criminal.
Always has been. Always has
And
been.
if motive doesn't matter, there's no way to distinguish between manslaughter and first degree murder. So, if motive, if you violate the law in order to install yourself as president, then, but you can't introduce the reason why you did it, as part of your case, then, there's no way to decide whether a coup is really a coup.
It even gets more complicated because you've heard Robert say, well, if he orders SEAL Team 6 to kill someone, they can be prosecuted, so they won't do it. But if the president has the ability to pardon them, why not do it? And
Well,
sure. All of these military commanders, generals, admirals had done an amicus brief as well, saying, don't allow this ruling to happen, because what are they going to do?
The shocking nature of the court's decision is also clear when you consider something that the president would do only by himself. Clearly, one of his core areas of power or responsibility is giving of pardons. But are we going to say that if the president takes an enormous bribe to pardon someone, that there's no accountability for that? That's what the court decision would indicate. And until yesterday, I think no one would have said, oh, well, of course, that couldn't happen. That could not be allowed. Now it seems that it could be allowed.
And we have seen the motives. It is so clear that the motive of what happened on January 6th was to deny a legitimate election, which has been adjudicated again and again and again and again to find that it was a legitimate election. So again, it's like saying that it doesn't matter, that the legal system, that the process is no longer there. So why do we have a court in the first place? And the Supreme Court says we're going to be the ones that decide these things.
The Supreme Court's decision yesterday, the court's decision yesterday disrespects the decisions in those 60-odd cases in which the lower courts addressed this question of what Trump was trying to do and found that his claims were baseless, that there had been no stealing of the election.
Right.
Now, I'm also wondering if this has a trickle-down influence on other branches of government, on our state government, on our legislators. Will we see laws change that say, okay, well, the president is immune because we don't want him or her to have to worry about lawsuits that might follow some decision that is made? So certainly that same case can be made for our governors and our members of Congress and our incumbent, mayors and so on. So it could become a vice that none of us can get out of, no matter what corner you're in. So it could just not stop with the president.
Well, this court tries to say that the president has an utterly unique place in American life, but you're absolutely right that once you start giving a pass to the president, you can start, other people could very easily claim that kind of pass. And, then, there'd be no place in American life that would be protected by law.
Yeah, sort of like the fall of the World Trade Centers, where the fire and the heat that melted those beams just caused that kind of pancake domino effect where each floor fell upon the next, and it went down in 10 seconds.
One of the
How
other
many
things,
seconds do we have before democracy is crushed in the
one
country?
of the things I think that we should probably at least acknowledge, and a lot of people have written and said this, of course, is during the impeachment, Mr. McConnell said very clearly that though he thought that Donald Trump was responsible, that you had the court system to rely on there, and that's gone. So it was not just our historical understanding of, but it was the precedent, what people believed at that time, which is to me really frightening, because I think we're now left wondering what is left. The other big issue was, we've had these discussions. Two of the justices, we know through their family or themselves, have been tied to the group of people who rioted at the Capitol on January the 6th. And the three of the other justices were all appointed by Donald Trump. At what point in a judicial system does someone say, I will recuse myself? The precedent had always been there that people would recuse themselves if they had these conflicts. And here you see the bittersweet fruit that has come from where we started with a court that has grown more and more and more a partisan court, very similar to what went on, in fact, with Dred Scott that I began with.
Vernon, it's just to add on to what you're saying. It strikes me that if we were to sort of resurrect the framers and ask them about this, a great many of them, and maybe I think probably a majority, would have said, in the end, traditions and laws like the ones you mentioned about recusal won't save us. And the word that I keep hearing in the television pundits and the newspaper pundits is character. In comparing Donald Trump and Joseph Biden, with all the physical frailties that the president has, the insistence has been over and over, but he is a man of good character. He is a decent man. Whereas those same people won't say the same thing about former President Trump. The word that the framers probably would have used, they might have said character, but the one that they used over and over was virtue. And that by virtue, they meant a willingness to put the public good ahead of private advantage. And they said over and over that a republic could not function without virtue in the citizens and the office holders. And you can have all the good laws in the world, and it won't do you any good without that. And there were many framers who thought that the Constitution wouldn't last a generation because they didn't think the American people had that much virtue. But, here we are at a place where what the framers would have regarded as virtue has been steadily losing prestige and authority over our public life, as we have emphasized over and over that the best way to attain the public good is for each person to pursue their own self-interest as avidly as possible. And then, when you average it all out and it comes out in the wash, that's the public good. Well, we see where that's gotten us.
Hmm.
And, at this point, I find myself thinking, who's the moral revivalist out there who will bring us back to the straight and narrow? I'm not sure we've got one. So that is what is discouraging me almost as much as anything else.
You probably want to edit this out, but Allan just tried to come in. Did you see that, Catherine?
I did. I'm waiting for him to try again.
When I make those parallels, and I don't do this lightly, but Lincoln began his career struggling with this whole idea of liberty and virtue and how in the world we could survive. And in that really first major speech he ever gave as a young man, the Lyceum speech, which he keeps refining, I think, till he got it right and eloquent in so many of his speeches. The struggle was at that time, how will this republic, which is still a fairly young republic today, we forget, but how will this republic survive? Because if you believe in liberty, which we're committed to, is as you say, Harry, so many things, well, it will all balance out if I go for what I think is my liberty. But on the one hand, he says you have total anarchy, and he gave those three famous examples of what was going on if you have anarchy. On the other side, it was like he was warning about what could even happen today, or for him as president of the Civil War. You have total authoritarianism, monarch, that. And so it seems to me that if Lincoln were here, that sort of second or third generation of founders, he would say, we just took a huge, huge step from that balance of which he relied on, as he called it, the rule of law, which he saw in the Constitution, toward authoritarianism, an incredible movement in terms of the shift, a major shift in what our country stands for, how the rule book has been interpreted, that we've moved far over on that spectrum toward authoritarianism. There's a great danger there, despite Justice Roberts trying to say, oh no, you're exaggerating. I have not yet heard a scholar or a legal mind that I respect not be upset by this decision.
And it does shed some light also, as we are in our talks about the election, the presidential election, and what's at stake. And it seems to, I guess, be a contrast, because we're saying that the democracy is at stake during the presidential race, at the same time that our Supreme Court is handing down a decision like this, which pretty much eviscerates democracy. So, whoever is the winner in the presidential race outcome, you will, what is left of democracy after you've had this decision, and how can that be resurrected? So I think that's a question that we'll have to make sure that we understand, that people have the nuances of it. Maybe we can do that in this conversation. And with this, we welcome Allan Lichtman. Thank you so much for jumping in. Again, I'm really appreciative of all four of you for, this last minute ability to respond to this call during the Supreme Court decision. But definitely, yes.
I'm on vacation, but for you, I managed to find a few minutes, and I'll give you my unique take on the Supreme Court and my unique take on Joe Biden.
Yes.
And you can follow me every Thursday at 9 p.m. in my live show, Eastern Time, at Allan Lichtman YouTube. All right. I will not focus just on the immunity decision. It's a mistake to consider that in isolation. You've got to consider that in tandem with other decisions that, taken together, not individually, lay a foundation for a Donald Trump authoritarian government. So on the one hand, we have the immunity decision. And remember, when Donald Trump was president, he said, I can do anything I want. And basically, the Supreme Court has now said that's right. You basically can do anything you want and evade any serious consequences, even when you leave office, much less when you are in office. And I'm sure some of you evoked what Richard Nixon said in 1977 after he resigned in disgrace. If the president does it, it's not illegal. And the entire country erupted in criticism, saying that's so outrageous. And now that's suddenly become the law of the land, according to the Supreme Court. But what else did the Supreme Court do? It basically made it almost impossible to find corruption among politicians. Combine what they did with the McDonald decision and this new decision, pretty much politicians can engage in any kind of corruption, and it's almost impossible to nail them. Then it eviscerated the federal regulatory regime, which means now the rich and corporations can basically do whatever they want and not be held accountable. And finally, it made it much more difficult to prosecute anyone for attempting a coup against the United States. Put all this together, and you have the basis for a Trump authoritarian regime. He said, I'll be a dictator only on day one, but all of us historians know every dictator that's been a dictator on day one, Harry, right, has been a dictator forever. You don't voluntarily give it up. Now, let me give you my take, and I've got an article coming out tomorrow in the New York Daily News on this. I've given, I don't know, a dozen media interviews on it. Why all of those pundits and critics who say Biden should be bumped from the ticket are so wrong. How many of them have a track record in actually predicting elections? Vernon, you know that. None of them, not a one. And yet they presume to claim that they can predict how the Democrats can win this time. I do have a system, keys to the White House, that's been right since 1984, 13 keys, and if 6 go against the White House party, they're predicted losers. Well, Biden checks off incumbency, and he checks off contest because he was uncontested for the nomination. You bump Biden, you lose incumbency, you lose contest. So instead of having to have 6 more keys to fall to predict the Democrats' defeat, only 4 more would have to fall. Finally, outside the context of the keys, since the turn of the 20th century, guess how many times the party holding the White House has won when there's an open seat, no incumbent running, and a contested or uncertain nomination? Never. And, you know, all those folks in the media, they're buddies of mine. I've known them for 50 years, but they have been deeply complicit with Donald Trump and promoting the Donald Trump candidacy. Why weren't the headlines? Donald Trump tries to con his way into the presidency with a lie every minute and 20 seconds in the debate, threatens dictatorship. Wasn't that a lot more important than Biden faltering? Yet all the headlines and all the attention has been on Biden and none of it on Trump, who poses the clear and present danger to our democracy, particularly in light of these Supreme Court decisions. I'll close with the old saying, it's not just the evil persons in this world who wreak havoc on us, it's the good persons who don't do enough to stop them.
Allan, I'd like for you to add, as I've told the media, tell me one person who can beat Trump besides Biden, particularly.
There isn't one.
Remember when Lyndon Johnson stepped back, and that was earlier to get Humphrey still it was close, but he did not win, and he had more time to pull all this together.
And when Truman pulled out, the Democrats lost, right? And lost big.
Well, what can we say that's going to be necessary strategy to address and save democracy on top of the election?
I have a book.
Whoever wins the election, whoever wins the election is still going to have this ruling.
Exactly.
to
First of all,
to face with that we have said might even trickle down into other branches of government, you know, on
it
a
will.
different scale.
It will.
If
Yeah.
people didn't learn anything from 2000 and 2000, it's a winner take all. And look at the consequences on the court, just the Supreme Court, but so many other things. So when they vote or don't vote, it really matters. In this case, I do think it is a vote for hopefully preserving what's left of democracy.
Which is in tatters. You know, my book is called 13 Cracks Preserving American Democracy After Trump, because it's not just Trump, the whole Republican Party. You know, they talk about the mainstream Republicans. There aren't any. The mainstream Republicans are now MAGA Republicans. Look at how all of them are willing to trash our justice system just because a jury of 12 ordinary people convicted Trump.
12 ordinary people picked by Trump's lawyers.
Exactly. And a judge who bent over backwards for Trump, didn't throw him in jail for 10 violations, made objections when Trump's lawyers were sitting on their hands. Absolutely, Harry.
Yeah. So and there are probably not going to be any other adjudication of any other Trump cases
Doesn't look
after
that
this
way.
point. After this point. So it's going to be all left up to the voters.
Looking down the road, Catherine, I think that constitutional amendment that you talked about earlier is going to be absolutely essential if we ever get to the place where we can pass such an amendment.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it may be, I still have hopes that it will be revisited by the court,
Well, maybe.
future court.
I hope so.
I really think it has
If
to.
it's a total revolution in the personnel and the makeup of the court, that is another possibility.
If Biden doesn't win, I think then there's no hope in terms of that. But if he does, I think a lot can happen.
Well, if
Legally and
wonderful,
not with riots and other things.
But one of the things, you know, looking again far down the road, we're going to need that constitutional amendment. And the other thing we're going to need is kind of an intellectual and moral revolution. And I mentioned the importance of virtue and character. The other thing I think is I'm going to put in a plug for political and constitutional history, which is very unfashionable in many history departments.
That's right.
Days. And there is a huge stress on social history, the way that ordinary people lived. And let's ignore law and politicians because that's just superstructure and who cares about that. Well, we don't have any weapons to protect a free society except those boring constitutional principles and legal principles and political traditions and yada, yada, yada. If we don't know them, however, by studying them in school, we can't use them. And we end up with absurdities like students saying in class, well, President so-and-so passed the income tax. Well, no. You know, any more than George III passed the Stamp Act, you know. If we don't understand those kinds of things, then I think our social historian friends and colleagues have got to make room in the syllabus for some of those you know, boring things that nevertheless make an enormous amount of difference.
And the two other things, and Paul, we need to get you back into this, but when you were going through the things, Allan, you added, and thank you for that, Citizens United and what it's done to democracy, allowing big money to dark money, as they would call it, to be used, and how that's influenced. And we've seen it, I believe, and this is an opinion I'm going out, that corruption in the Supreme Court in terms of how money is used there. The other thing is the Electoral College, which we as historians know It was founded in the sin of slavery to give more representation to enslavers. That has continued, that these Supreme Court justices, the last three, were all appointed by someone who lost a popular election that most Americans did not vote for. And I think those kind of structural issues are things that can be addressed if Congress is willing to. And that's a tough one, of course, particularly the one where money's involved.
Right, right. And I hear a couple of things that we want to really focus on as actions. One is the possibility of the Supreme Court revisiting this down the road. Another is the idea of elected and other leaders with virtue and connection to that kind of character that's going to make sure that we're providing the underline that we need for certain kind of actions. We're also looking at the vote and what's going to happen with this current election and the ability to get the people out to vote who currently aren't voting. There's a movement with the Poor People's Campaign that just met in DC this year, and they're making the attempt to get the millions of low and moderate and low wealth people who typically don't vote out to vote. So that's part of their effort. I'm also working with a number of organizations that is focusing on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and working to have revisions in various voting rights legal actions that can make sure that people are more able to vote. So I think we have a couple of things that might give us some hope in the face of this court ruling, that are actions that we can take if enough political will and mobilization happens to bring that about.
I'm hoping for mobilization. I really hope that people will get out in the streets in peaceful demonstration to stand up for the principles on which the country was founded and to point out how wrong-headed this Supreme Court decision is and what drastic results could come from it. I am looking for my local party here or for activists in my local area to propose some demonstrations, and I hope that this is going to happen across the country.
Hear, hear.
Well, I think at this point, we wanted to talk an hour, and we're coming to the close of that. So I wanted to give each of you the opportunity to make a quick summary of what your thoughts are and what you think the way is going forward. So why don't we start with Harry and go around?
Well, I've already said some things about what to do going forward. Structurally, of course, we will need electoral victories, and the electoral victories must lead to constitutional amendments and statutes that will reinforce the rule of law. And I think that those electoral victories have got to be underpinned by some moral reflection about character and virtue and what Americans desperately need to recognize that the interests of the country must be put ahead of personal advancement, so that when somebody like Trump comes along, enough of us will want to blow the whistle and stop that. There are plenty of things to disagree about without turning us into a homogeneous block, and that's not at all what I'm saying. But we do need that underlying cultural commitment.
Thank you, Harry. Paul, did you want to tap on to what you just said or expand that in any way in your closing thoughts?
Well, I will say as a closing thought that we are indeed in a very, very serious crisis. I never would have believed at any prior time in my life that we would be facing these kinds of issues. And commentary, even well-informed and incisive commentary, is not going to solve the problem. We need to have public action. We really need to have American citizens standing up for American values and for the idea of this government, which includes at its core the idea that no man is above the law.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Allan?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. But I would add, we are scholars. We're not necessarily political organizers.
Mhm.
And what I've been trying to do, and what I think is a very important role for us scholars, is to tell the truth about American history and tell the truth about the perilous moment we're in and why we're in that moment and what we need to do about it. You know, the Donald Trump campaign at its core is a campaign against truth. It's 1984 all over again. You know, war is peace, famine is plenty. And what we've been trained to do and what we're trying to train our students to do is to uncover the truth. And if you lose the truth, you lose everything. So I've been trying in every forum I can to tell the truth about our history, about Donald Trump, about what's happened in the Supreme Court and what can be done about it. And I would hope every responsible scholar in the country would join in this effort.
Thank you. Thank you. And Vernon?
I'll reinforce again what everyone has said. I do think this election is certainly the most important in my lifetime, ever, I think, in terms of if you care about democracy. To follow what Allan says, this court ignored evidence. Evidence is so important. If you cannot put evidence forward and rely on it and just make up what you want, what do we have? You know, this is very frightening. And we're in a period, again, like with the Civil War, people forget when we look at media and people look at whether it's MSNBC or Fox News, you can go on down the range, people are listening to each other. But we've been there before, and people forget this. And I'm reminded of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. If you read the newspapers of that time, remember the newspapers were political newspapers. They were owned by the political party. It's just like today. So Lincoln gives a speech, and I actually read this one, and you read what the Democratic paper said at that time. It was Lincoln was so drunk, he made no sense. He was inebriated. He wandered all clearly this very ignorant thing. In fact, he was so out of it that his supporters literally carried him out of the building because he was unable to walk. Remember, he was a prohibitionist, incidentally, and didn't drink. You read the Whig paper, and what does it say? Lincoln gave the most stirring, great speech of all time. It inspired us all to fight for democracy, etc. And they hoisted it on his shoulders and carried him out of the building. The only thing that's true in both of them, he was carried out of the building.
Yeah, the
And
only
so
truth
we
is
now
coming.
face, how do we get the truth out to people?
Right.
And I think we didn't realize that we lived through a generation where we were able at one time with newspapers, reporters, and independent to sort of sift out evidence to get at the truth. So it makes it even harder. And as I think all of us believe, that's why it's so important that we speak out from what we have learned over our lifetime studying American history. Not that we can predict, but that we understand what a difference it makes to understand what's going on and how we got to where we are and what this whole democracy is about and how do we survive without the rule of law.
Right, right. Well, I want to thank each one of you for taking the time. You know, this is the 4th of July week, so vacation is on everybody's minds, and even so, you gave me a part of your time and a part of time to the public, because this is going to be seen by the activist public and the scholarly public and the ordinary community to help all of us move forward in this. So thanks again to Vernon Burton, the Judge Matthew J. Perry, Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University, to Allan Lichtman at American University, to Paul D. Escott, Reynolds Professor of History Emeritus at Wake Forest University, Harry L. Watson, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Atlanta, Distinguished Professor of Southern Culture Emeritus. Thanks to each one of you for talking about this important Trump v. United States SCOTUS ruling today. And thanks to everybody who is joining us on our channel. I want to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And if, everybody who hasn't done that, please make sure you subscribe. That's going to help this message get out to more people. Like and subscribe. And we will be able to produce more of this kind of content and discussion that's intended to help us in the service of protecting our democracy, protecting the rule of law, and making more of our public able to do those things that contribute to that effort. So,
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
And good evening.
Enjoy.